Good morning. Welcome to the St. Croix Seashell Museum. We're located here at the St. George Village Botanical Garden. I am Sharon Grimes and my videographer is Marcia Taylor. We are going to talk today about some very special shells that I call giants. I've got a table full of giant seashells here. Most seashells that we find are about the size of my hand, or many are much smaller than that. But some shells can grow to large sizes and live for a very long time. All of these shells on this table were purchased from dealers. They were collected more than 30 years ago, or at least 30 years ago and longer, and they're mostly protected now. You're only going to find sizes like this in museums or in private collections. They have been affected either by changes in the environment, that maybe they don't grow to this size anymore, or maybe they've been overfished or over-collected, but you just don't find seashells this size anymore, except for maybe the queen conch. The queen conch is the territorial shell of the Virgin Islands. They're found in the Atlantic and in the Caribbean. This guy is about 10 inches long, and they can grow up to 14 inches, and it is one of the largest shells in the Caribbean. They live in the seagrass beds to about 100 feet. They feed on algae on the seagrass. They are used for eating and also for making horns. The Native Americans would use these to make tools. They would use them for cookware. It could be like a pot to boil your water in, or they used them for jewelry. And the animal, this is the operculum that is attached to the animal's body. They come out of their shell and stick their foot out, and they use the operculum to hop along in the beds of seagrass. This next shell is the lightning whelk. It is found in the Gulf of Mexico, and it is the state shell of Texas. This particular guy is 11 inches long, but they can grow up to 14.5 inches. They are interesting because they are left-handed seashells. Most of the shells, you stick your right hand into the opening. This shell, your left hand goes into the opening. They live in shallow bays on mud or sand. They eat bivalves by boring holes into the shells. We don't really know how long they live. They do have an operculum where they can suck their body into the shell and totally close the shell off so that predators cannot get to it. Another big Atlantic shell is the Florida horse conch. These grow in the Atlantic and the Gulf of Mexico. This one is a really nice one. It is up to 15 inches, but they can grow up to 23 inches. They live in sand and mud, and they feed on the queen conch. So if you find a bed of seagrass with queen conch in it in Florida, chances are you'll find the Florida horse conch there as well. They do have the large operculum where they can, again, it's attached to the body, they can completely close off the shell. It is the state shell of Florida, and Native Americans use these as a drinking cup. Our next shell is the Atlantic Triton trumpet. We do have these in the Virgin Islands area. They don't grow to this size anymore. This one is 12 inches, but they can grow over 15 inches long. They live in the sand or seagrass, and they feed on starfish and sea cucumbers. And hermit crabs, if you can imagine a hermit crab being this large, I don't think so, can use the shells as homes. This one has a very nice large operculum. It's kind of squared off here. And this one, I don't have the operculum for this one, but this is a very old seashell. All the rest of the shells that I'm going to talk about are from the Pacific. They are much bigger shells, it seems. The Pacific's a bigger ocean, so maybe it has bigger seashells. But This is the Pacific version of the Atlantic Triton trumpet. It's the cousin. It is grows in the Indian Ocean, the Pacific, and the Red Sea. This one is 14 inches, but they can grow up to 24 inches. The natives in Polynesia would use these for a horn, just like we use the queen conch for a horn. It lives on coral reefs. It eats the crown of thorn and starfish, sometimes used as a trumpet or for decoration. This is a giant spider conch. It's still a conch, doesn't look like the queen conch very much, but it's called a spider conch because it has the legs, the spines. It lives in the Indian and Pacific Oceans. This one is about 12.5 inches, but they can grow to nearly 16 inches, and they are the largest and the heaviest of the spider shells. There are many versions of spider conchs. They live on rubble and sand in shallow water, and they feed on algae. The next shell I have is the horned helmet. This is a very heavy shell. It's from the Philippines in the Indian Ocean and the Red Sea. It's a really big shell. It's the largest of all the helmet shells. They can grow up to 16 inches long, although this one is about a foot. They live along the reefs and sand, and they eat the crown of thorn starfish, just like the Triton trumpet does. That makes the crown of thorn starfish destroys coral. So this is a very valuable shell, and it's protected in some areas. And humans would use these to carve into cameos. You may have seen cameos made from helmet shells before. It's a very beautiful ornate shell when it's polished. Then I have this big trumpet shell. This is an Australian trumpet. It is from northern Australia. It can grow up to 36 inches. This one's only 21 inches long, but try to think about a snail this big. That's hard for me to imagine a snail being that large. It is the largest gastropod, which is the spiral shells, the single valve spiral shells. It lives on sandy bottoms down to about 90 feet, and it eats bristle worms. It can be used as a water carrier. The Australian Aborigines made nose pins. They would carve little pieces of the shell off and make body decorations with this particular shell. This one has been polished. It is not what it would look like if you were able to find it on the ocean floor. The next two shells I'm going to talk about are also from Australia, just like the Australian trumpet. This one it's a volute. It's called the Australian Baler, and it is from northern Australia. It lives on muddy bottoms down to about 30 feet. It does not have an operculum. It has the little horns, spines around the top of it, but no operculum. It feeds on other seashells, and it can be used to carry water. That's why it's called a baler, because fishermen could use this to bail out their canoes if they were taking on water. So that's the northern baler. And this one is the southern baler. It's called the Miltoni baler. This one's 11.5 inches long, but these can also grow to about 18 inches. It lives in the shallow seas down to about 60 feet. It feeds on other mollusks, and it can also be used to hold water. So the Aborigines could use it. They could use them for cooking or for bailing. This is the giant ton shell. It lives in shallow tropical seas down deep on muddy bottoms. This one is 9 inches, and this is about as big as these guys get. It eats sea cucumbers. It has a very large opening here. It also has an operculum, so it can seal off the shell. And a really interesting fact about these giant tons is that the body is luminescent. It gives off a green white light when the animal is out crawling around on the seabed. I don't know of any other sea shell that has a luminescent body like this one in particular does. This one is a great green turban shell. If this were a fresh new shell, it would be a very green shell. You can see in the beginnings of the shell, it looks a little bit like the top shells that we have here in Virgin Islands. But these live in the Indian Ocean or the Western Pacific. It's a very heavy shell. They live near coral reefs down to about 100 feet. These also feed on algae. This one is 7 inches, but these can grow to about 9.5 inches. And it has a very pearly inside. And in Polynesia, the natives would use these to make buttons and jewelries. Big heavy shell, and it's green. Okay. The last shells I'm going to talk about are all bivalves, and they're also the largest seashells in the world. This first guy is called the noble pin shell. It is a bivalve. Unfortunately, when I bought him, I was kind of tricked by the seller, and I only got 1/2 of the valve. But when it's alive, it has another valve just that's a mirror image of the one that I'm holding, and it can open and close to feed on particulates floating in the water. This is found in the Mediterranean. This one is 17 inches in length, but they can grow to 4 feet, if you can imagine a 4-foot bivalve. They live in the sandy bottom. They bury themselves in the mud. They are filter feeders, like I mentioned. They attach themselves, they stand up vertically in the sand. They attach themselves with threads called byssal threads to hold into the sand to keep them standing up straight. And back in biblical times, people would make fabric. They would collect the threads and weave them into fabrics. This is a giant clam, but this is not a giant. This is the only sample of a giant clam that I have. These live in the Pacific on coral reefs, down to about 66 feet deep. They can grow up to 4.5 feet wide and weigh up to 500 pounds. These are the largest living bivalve, and they live about 100 years. They get most of their nutrition from algae that lives just inside in their bodies and just inside the seashell. They have eye spots that are along the outside. They're on the body, but they're along the outside edge of the shell. And the light spots or eye spots are sensitive to light, so that if there's a sudden darkness, like a shadow passing over, the shell can close itself to be kept away from predators. But they can't close their shell all the way. When I was researching for this program, I found out that for many, many years, these shells were considered to be man-eaters, and even the U.S. Navy Diver's Handbook had guidance on how to free yourself from a giant clam. I find that just hilarious. The shell closes so slowly. I don't know, but I think that's just really funny. So the last bivalve I have doesn't look like a bivalve at all. This is the giant mud-dwelling shipworm. It's from the Pacific and the Philippines. This one is 27.75 inches long, but they can grow up to 5 feet long. We don't know how long they live. They have only recently been discovered live, but they live in the mud, and they'll have only the 2 valves. Hopefully you can see here that there's 2 valves at the end. It's a single opening up until this point, but these 2 valves would just barely be sticking out of the mud. And the mud that it lives in is pretty stinky and nasty. So this shipworm has bacteria that live inside the body, and these bacteria convert the hydrogen sulfide in the mud to turn it into organic carbon to feed the shipworm. Again, this is one of the 3 largest mollusks, and these 3 that I have on the table do grow to be the world's largest mollusks. So I hope you find this interesting. Again, you're going to have to go to museums other than our seashell museum to find these big seashells. Thank you.